I'm here today with Paul Gorski, founder of the Equity Literacy Institute and EdChange. He's a longtime teacher educator and author of several books about equity and justice, including Reaching and Teaching Students in Poverty, Strategies for Erasing the Opportunity Gap. Welcome, Paul. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks, Sarah. Great to be here with you.
So in your article in the October issue of Educational Leadership, you write that to become truly trauma-informed, schools must map out all the way students, families, and even educators experience trauma at school. Can you share examples of the kind of trauma that's occurring within school walls or even in virtual settings?
Absolutely. You know, the areas that I'm most tapped into probably around equity issues, around how students are experiencing racism, sexism, transphobia, ableism, all sorts of inequities along those lines in schools. And I tell a story in the article about a young woman who is transgender African-American young woman who talked to me about how, you know, school was the major source of her trauma because of the racism and transphobia she experienced, like teachers refusing to use her pronouns or her name. So there are certainly a lot of examples of that, as well as, you know, I talk about the impact that the sort of hyper-punitive culture of schools can have on children, which I think can be quite traumatizing in and of itself. And there's research, I talk about this in that poverty book, about the ways that parents experiencing poverty often feel marginalized when they visit their children's school, which is actually part of the reason they're less likely to visit their children's school. Not the only reason, but part of the reason. As well as, you know, thinking about people who work in the school, I have research that I've done that show, for instance, how educators who speak up about issues like racism and heterosexism in schools often face scorn from their own colleagues that could be traumatizing.
What's a key component of trauma-informed education that schools often overlook?
Well, I think the thing that they most overlook is that kind of like what I say in the article, that trauma-informed or trauma-sensitive education is not compatible with hyper-punitive school cultures. And unfortunately, I would say most schools have a kind of a hyper-punitive culture. So that I think the big problem with trauma-informed in all these programs is that it's sort of applied selectively or kind of pulled out of a filing cabinet and applied to certain contexts, when really it's meant to sort of help us rethink all of what we're doing in schools. And I think that a key component of that is changing the institutional culture to not be hyper-punitive or reactive when it comes to student behavior. Like, I don't understand why, if we are going to get at the root causes of behaviors, we would predetermine punishments for every possible behavior. That just doesn't make sense. You know, that component of kind of rethinking how we do discipline seems like a big one.
What should trauma-informed education look like in a virtual setting?
Wow, that's a really great question. I mean, in essence, I think it kind of looks the same. For instance, this idea of accounting for structural injustice and the traumatic impacts of structural injustice. If I have a policy like students must leave their cameras on, then I'm really not accounting for that. There are students who might not want to, who might find it quite traumatizing to invite me or to have me come uninvited into their space through their cameras. You know, I think that's sort of an example. I think a lot of the other examples are sort of the same in person as they are virtually, as accounting for the differences in people's experiences that come from trauma, especially the traumas of institutionalized or structural injustice. and how that impacts children.
What should school leaders avoid when implementing trauma-informed programs?
Well, I think the biggest problem there is trying to take an institutional culture as it exists and then layer trauma-informed practices on top of that. So, I think they should avoid this approach where they're going to just sort of take a prefabricated framework and apply it when they haven't done the work institutionally for that to work. So for instance, the schools and districts with which I've worked, schools and districts that start with a racial justice framework and then incorporate trauma-informed into that, the trauma-informed practices look very different. And schools that don't do that, the trauma-informed practices look like the same racist practices that existed before they applied trauma-informed. So I think, and I would say this for all of these kind of shiny new programs, the tendency to want to just sort of plop them into an institution like they are going to change the institutional culture by themselves. We have to change the institutional culture for the trauma-informed practices, to work. I think sort of avoiding that idea that this is going to solve the problems for us that it can't possibly solve.
How does a trauma-informed principal lead differently?
I think a trauma-informed principal is very attuned to the policies and practices and aspects of institutional culture that are actually traumatizing people. That I think a principal should have sort of a radar for that, and be willing to change things, to shift things, to eliminate those sorts of conditions. I think a trauma-informed principal is highly attuned to the traumatic impacts of racism, sexism, and understanding how those things are operating in very subtle ways within the school. Like I talk in the article about, a lot of trauma isn't caused by big traumatic events, but by the sort of grind of sort of ongoing, smaller, kind of microaggressive kinds of traumas, that the accumulative impact of that over time. And I have to be I have to develop a way of recognizing how that stuff is operating around me. And I think, in terms of the traumas that adults experience, I think leaders sort of modeling, leaders trying to model an approach that pushes back against institutional bits of institutional culture that are trauma that we hold on to because maybe it's part of a legacy of something, or maybe this is the way we've always done things. I can't hold on to things like that and be trauma sensitive at the same time.
So in the same vein, how would a trauma-informed teacher teach differently?
Well, I think a trauma-informed teacher, the sort of trauma-informed context should be informing every single thing that the teacher does. I think, for instance, curricular erasure, having LGBTQ plus students sitting through a class where they're invisible in the curriculum. I think a lot of teachers, it wouldn't even occur to them that it would be part of trauma-informed education. Just basically teaching equitably and justly would be part of sort of a core approach to trauma-informed education. I think also, just in terms of maybe not teaching so much as kind of classroom management stuff, is that I have to let go of the tendency to sort of be a reactive rule flinger and just act reactively to student behaviors, and really have the patience to think about what might be underlying student behaviors, and how do I create a classroom environment that truly feels safe to everybody, and that in fact prioritizes safety for the students who are cheated out of safe learning environments in so much of their educational careers.
So instead of reacting to students' behavior, how might a teacher respond in a more trauma-informed way?
Well, I think the approach is always to understand the behavior in its context and to show concern about every behavior. If a student is showing up to class late a lot or to school late a lot, I think I need to try to understand what's happening there and show concern. And I see in the article, even if a student shows up to school high or drunk or whatever it is, I find it odd in schools that we have reactive punishments to things like that, when usually kids who are doing that are self-medicating. So try to understand what's happening and respond to what's happening that's causing the behavior instead of just reacting to the behavior itself. Try to understand behaviors in context. In fact, if I'm not willing to do that, I'm not doing trauma-informed education at all. That's the root of trauma-informed education, that certain behaviors and responses from students might be attached to traumas that they've experienced. They might have even experienced those traumas from me in my own classroom. And so I have to sort of let go of that and be more open to understanding. So I think the reaction should be show concern. Show concern. That should be my reaction. I should be concerned about the student's well-being and how certain behaviors might be a reflection of sort of a hitch in students' well-being. So I always say, first, make sure everybody's safe. Second, show concern. I think that should be the response.
How can educators be responsive to the stress and possible trauma in their students' and colleagues' lives?
Well, I want to kind of zero in on that racism piece. I think all of those things are connected to the racism piece. And I think the first thing I need to do is understand racism and structural racism and its impact and its traumatizing impact. I mean, research shows that structural racism contributes to intergenerational, cross-generational trauma. We know that based on piles and piles of research and studies that have been done about that. So if I don't first acknowledge the existence of that racism, and I don't understand its impact inside and outside of schools on my students, then I can't be responsive. To my students who are experiencing that. A recent study showed that African-American youth experience racism, acts of racism, 5 times a day on average. So if I don't understand that, and I don't understand the impact of that on students, and I don't, acknowledge how that also plays out in education, that some of those experiences are happening actually in school, then I can't be trauma informed. So I think part of it is about understanding as deeply as possible how racism operates, not just interpersonally, like one mean person doing something to somebody else, but the accumulative impact of racism in education, of racism in employment, of racism in housing, of racism in all of these different systems. The accumulative impact of that has a tremendous traumatizing effect on many, many people of color, people of the global majority. And my first step is just being willing to understand that, that sometimes how a student might be responding to me, or a student might be engaging or not engaging or resisting engaging in school is actually a very reasonable response to what they are experiencing, often in schools as well as outside of schools. So I think I have to understand that as deeply and complexly as possible listen to and hear and seek out the stories of people who are experiencing that and understand the impact of that, and then be willing to change what I'm doing, change my own policies, my own practices, shift the institutional culture to be responsive to that, to be actively anti-racist in order to sort of counteract that. I could do that through curriculum. I could do that through pedagogy. I could do that through rethinking everything that we do in schools.
It was really interesting when you were mentioning about in a virtual setting, like forcing a student's camera to be on.
I've thought about the impacts of grading and what is the value of grading and what is the value of failing students. It feels like failing students is literally failing students. That kind of the institutional culture that we're even talking about grades, or even talking about, I mean, we should rethink grades overall in the bigger scope of education anyway, because I think that's a harmful practice. But things like grading, things like punishing students for not logging in on time. Those are all things that are not taking into account context. We know, for instance, that the parents and caretakers who are most likely to be able to work from home are disproportionately white, middle class or wealthier, people with college degrees. The people who are least likely to be able to work from home are people of color who don't have college degrees, who are working class or experiencing poverty. So what that means is that many disproportionately students experiencing poverty and students of color are more likely to have multiple responsibilities at home, taking care of younger siblings, taking care of elders, and those sorts of things, and putting them in a position to have to make a choice between these family responsibilities. I'm going to be punished by school if I choose these family responsibilities over making sure I'm logging in on time. That's a sort of, and again, these things just reflect the same kind of thinking that happened before COVID.
Right.
But I think that's another example of kind of the same kind of traumas that happened before COVID and before the distance remote learning happened. It's just sort of magnified by the distance learning.
It was great talking to you and meeting you.
Yeah, good talking to you too.